LA is on fire.
January 7th, 2025. Los Angeles woke to a sky that didn't look like morning. A thick, amber haze stretched across the horizon, swallowing the sun. The air was dry, unnervingly still, as if the city itself was holding its breath. And then the wind shifted. That's when it began. The Palisades fire tore through the hills with a hunger that no one was ready for. By midday, entire neighborhoods were choking on smoke. Roads crumbled into confusion. More than 100,000 people fled their homes, but not everyone could run. Not everyone had somewhere to go. In the middle of this chaos stood Michael Reed, just an ordinary man in an extraordinary nightmare. He wasn't prepared for any of it. Not the wall of fire crawling closer by the minute. Not the emergency alerts flashing on his phone, cold and emotionless. And certainly not the impossible decision he was about to make. Michael wasn't alone. His 79-year-old father-in-law sat quietly inside the house, his body frail and slowing from the grip of Parkinson's disease. Moving him wouldn't be easy, but staying was certain death. There was no evacuation order, no sirens screaming through the streets, just silence. Michael checked his phone again. Another warning, but no help. No car sat in the driveway. No way out. Only thickening smoke creeping toward their doorstep. In moments like this, we all like to think we'd know what to do. That instinct would take over, that we'd act without hesitation. But when the world begins to burn, instinct can feel like a distant echo. Michael hesitated. Minutes passed. Flames inched closer. And behind the scenes of this disaster, something far worse waited. Not in the fire, but in the quiet choices that led up to it. This is the story of how hesitation can cost everything, and how one decision can mean the difference between life and death. Michael Reed was about to find out just how far he was willing to go to survive, and how far the fire was willing to chase him. What would you do if fire surrounded your home, and there was no way out? Before the sky turned to ash and the air thickened with smoke, Los Angeles carried on as usual. The city moved with its typical rhythm. Morning commuters filling freeways, children laughing on their way to school, and neighbors watering their lawns under the winter sun. Life in the Palisades was peaceful, almost idyllic. Rows of houses stretched along quiet hills, framed by swaying palm trees and distant ocean views. There was no sign of what was coming. But on January 7th, 2025, that peace was shattered. The Palisades fire wasn't the first wildfire to threaten Los Angeles. But this was different. It moved faster than anyone could have imagined, fed by bone-dry winds and brittle brush that had been waiting months, years to burn. In a matter of hours, flames had devoured miles of hillside, casting a dark veil over the city. Evacuation orders trickled in, but they were scattered, unclear. Sirens echoed far off in the distance, but not here. Not yet. And in the middle of this, there was Michael Reed. Michael wasn't a firefighter. He wasn't a first responder. He was just a man, a husband, a father, standing at the edge of something he couldn't comprehend. His home sat nestled in the hills, surrounded by trees now turning to kindling. Inside, his 79-year-old father-in-law, Walter, sat quietly in his chair. Walter wasn't like he used to be. Parkinson's disease had taken its toll, slowing his steps, stealing his strength. Michael knew moving him wouldn't be easy, but the thought of leaving him behind? Impossible. At 11:42 a.m., Michael's phone vibrated. A wildfire has been reported in your area. Stay alert for updates. That was it. No instructions. No warnings to leave. Just a message. Simple. Detached. Michael stared at the screen, then out the window. The sky didn't look dangerous. Not yet. The wind was still. The air was quiet, but that quiet wouldn't last. Minutes passed. The message sat on his phone, unread a second time, as if reading it again might change the words. Michael called his wife. No answer. Called again. Nothing. He thought about driving Walter to safety, but the car was gone. His wife had taken it earlier that morning. No backup plan. No escape. He thought about calling for help. 911. All circuits are currently busy. Please hold. The line was dead. So was every other number he tried. And that's when the second alert came. Wildfire in your area. Conditions may change rapidly. Be prepared to evacuate. Michael stepped outside. This time, the sky wasn't blue. It was gray. Smoke curled over the hills, staining the horizon. And there, just beyond the trees, a faint orange glow. Closer than it should have been. Closer than he wanted to believe. Michael knew then this wasn't a warning. It was a countdown, but he had no car. No way to move Walter. No one answering the phone. Minutes passed. Minutes he didn't have. And with each one, the fire inched closer. And behind it all, something far worse than flames was moving in. Something that couldn't be seen, but could be felt in the stillness of that house. It wasn't the fire itself. It was the weight of waiting too long. The moment when hesitation becomes a trap. Michael Reed had to make a choice. But in this fire, even the right choice might be too late. The decision to stay or go is not always clear. For most people, evacuation orders are simple, mandatory. But for Michael Reed, there was no order, no guidebook, no clear choice. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the phone in his hand, the second alert still glowing on the screen, as the house felt smaller and smaller. He looked toward the front door, toward the windows. The smoke, still faint, now began to clog the air. His throat burned. The scent of charred wood creeping inside the house, as though it were already invading. Maybe we wait, he said aloud to himself, his words barely above a whisper. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but his mind was racing. The fire, yes, it was out there, but maybe it wasn't so close. Maybe the wind would change. Maybe it wasn't as bad as they said. His eyes flickered over to Walter, sitting by the window. Walter had been a sturdy man once, a carpenter by trade. But now, Parkinson's had reduced him to slow, deliberate movements, his shaking hands gripping the armrest. His eyes, though tired, remained steady. Michael knew, deep down, that if they left now, it wouldn't be easy to move Walter. If they stayed, they risked being trapped. Do we stay? Michael asked, his voice barely audible. His wife, Sarah, had left with the car that morning, but she hadn't come back yet, and now the minutes seemed to stretch into an endless silence. There was a tension, thick and suffocating, hanging in the air. Michael's heart pounded harder with each passing second, and his thoughts felt like they were spiraling. But the truth was, he didn't know what to do. Could they afford to wait? Could he risk it? Or was it already too late? The wind is picking up. Walter rasped from his chair, his voice barely a whisper. It was a hollow sound, distant, as if his words were being carried on the breeze. He looked outside, his eyes wide with fear. Michael followed his gaze. The sky, once clear, was now an angry gray. A streak of orange bled through the clouds, and the trees just beyond their property had begun to bend in the wind. The fire wasn't miles away anymore. It was closer, much closer. Michael could see the glow of flames reflecting off the clouds. It danced in the distance, flickering like some kind of malevolent spirit coming for them. It felt as though the air itself was pressing in, suffocating. The reality of the situation was becoming undeniable. "We can't stay here," Michael muttered, the words barely audible in the thickening air. He turned toward the hallway, walking to the door with a growing sense of urgency. He pulled the door open slowly, letting in a gust of smoke. His breath caught in his chest as the heat surged into the house. It wasn't just the fire anymore. It was everywhere. The world was closing in. He rushed to his phone, dialing 911 again, his fingers shaking as he typed. The screen blinked back a message he already knew. No service. His heart sank. And then something else, a thought that was more horrifying than the smoke outside. If they couldn't get help, if they couldn't escape, then what? The fire wasn't waiting for anyone to make up their mind. It didn't care about uncertainty. It didn't care about plans. "I've got to get Walter out," he whispered under his breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle like a stone in his chest. But how? How could he move Walter when the air felt as though it was closing in around them? How could he navigate a firestorm with a man who could barely walk, let alone run? It was too risky, too dangerous. The minutes felt like hours as the pressure mounted, but in that suffocating silence, something unexpected happened. A sudden knock at the door, soft, hesitant, but there. Michael froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. His eyes darted toward Walter, who was already looking toward the door, his face etched with confusion. "Oh," Michael murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. It wasn't possible. Not here, not now. Another knock, louder this time, more persistent. He didn't recognize the voice calling through the door. "Hey, you guys all right? It's Max from down the street. Need some help?" Max, the neighbor. Michael didn't know him well, only waved at him on occasion as their paths crossed. Two strangers connected only by proximity. But here, now, in the thick of it, he was offering something Michael couldn't ignore. He was offering a chance, a fleeting opportunity. Michael hesitated, unsure whether he could trust this sudden stranger or if this was some cruel twist of fate. He had no other options, and time was running out. The fire was moving faster now. He could feel the heat from the outside, radiating through the walls, as though it were reaching out for them. Michael opened the door, squinting through the smoke. The image of Max standing there was oddly out of place. Calm, cool-headed, as though the world hadn't just exploded into chaos. But what was he really offering? "Get in. Get to the car," Max said simply, his voice firm with an unspoken urgency. "I've got a ride. It's not much, but it's better than sitting here." Michael didn't think twice. He grabbed Walter, helping him to his feet, and guided him toward the door. The old man's legs trembled, but he moved. Slowly, steadily. They shuffled outside, past the garden now covered in a thin veil of ash. The air was thick with smoke, suffocating. Every breath felt like inhaling fire itself. They reached the car. The tires crunched on gravel as Michael helped Walter into the back seat. The flames were closer now, their orange glow lighting the sky, casting an eerie glow across the neighborhood. The fire was alive, chasing them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Max didn't say much as he sped down the street. The car lurched forward, its tires squealing on the pavement. For a moment, Michael thought they were going to make it. But then, just as quickly as the hope had flared, it dimmed. The traffic ahead had stopped. A wall of cars, all trying to get out at the same time. The flames were closer now. The heat was unbearable. It was as if the fire had found them, pinpointed them. Michael could feel the panic rising in his chest. He looked over at Max, his hands tight on the wheel. Max's face was grim, his jaw set. This wasn't just an escape anymore. It was survival, and they weren't going to make it out that easily. The world outside had become a war zone, each corner of the city consumed by chaos. As the car tore down the road, Michael could feel the heavy thud of his heartbeat in his chest, echoing through his body with every jolt of the tires. The flames, now visible in the distance, stretched higher with each passing second, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. He wasn't sure if he was imagining the heat or if it was truly the fire creeping closer. His throat burned with every breath. Walter, still in the back seat, clutched his cane tightly, his knuckles white against the wood. He hadn't said a word in what felt like hours. Maybe it was the shock. Maybe it was the fire. But Michael could feel his eyes flickering, his body trembling in a way that made Michael wish he had thought ahead. Wished that he could have carried him. Wished he could have done something more. And then, ahead of them, the worst nightmare of all. A wall of cars, bumper to bumper, immobilized. People sat behind their steering wheels, their faces glazed with fear, their hands gripping the wheel with desperation. The gridlock was suffocating. The stench of burnt rubber mixed with the acrid scent of smoke filled the air, making it hard to see. The weight of the moment pressed down like a physical force. They were trapped. Michael's pulse quickened. He glanced at Max, whose expression had hardened into something resolute, something more than just a neighbor helping out. There was fear in his eyes, but beneath it, something else was brewing. A desperate drive to survive, to escape. The words were stuck, burned at the tip of Michael's tongue, but he bit them back. There was no room for defeat now. Not when they were so close, and yet so far from safety. Max, Michael croaked, we have to get out of here. The fire. It's getting too close. Max didn't respond at first. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and he swerved sharply to the side, onto an even smaller side road, the tires crunching against the gravel. The car lurched forward, skidding dangerously. Michael's heart seemed to leave his chest and float somewhere above the chaos. Was this really happening? Were they really about to drive right into the flames? The closer they got to the fire, the more the world around them distorted. It felt like a nightmare, a fever dream. The smoke had thickened, and every breath Michael took felt like inhaling hot coals. The fire ahead seemed almost alive, breathing, moving with the wind as if it were trying to catch them. The orange glow from the flames illuminated the sky in terrifying shades of crimson and amber, casting a hellish glow over the wreckage of the gridlocked cars that they passed. As they pushed forward, Michael could hear the crackling of fire in the distance, the trees around them already burning, some toppling over into the road. The scent of burning wood, burning flesh, an overpowering, suffocating smell poured through the open windows. The air had become a heavy, choking blanket that refused to let them breathe. Keep going. We can't stop now, Michael urged, his voice a raw rasp as he looked frantically toward Max. But even as Max sped ahead, the road seemed to conspire against them. Fallen branches, charred debris from the rapidly advancing flames, blocked their path. The car lurched as Max swerved to miss them, his hands gripping the wheel with an unrelenting force. The heat outside now felt like an oven pressing against the car like a furnace. Michael could feel it through the glass of the window. They were too close to the fire. Far too close. Just then, in the corner of his eye, Michael saw something. A flash of movement. An orange flicker. It's spreading faster than we thought, Michael whispered to himself, his voice thick with dread. In the rearview mirror, he saw something he couldn't explain. A streak of flame, a horrifying leap of fire, as if the very air was carrying it, feeding it. Just beyond the row of cars, a sudden gust of wind carried the fire across the road, and it jumped. Just 15 feet from them. The flames didn't just move, they jumped. Like a beast set loose, the fire surged across the road, flaring up like a wave crashing against the rocks. The air itself seemed to bend in that moment, distorting with the force of the blaze. Michael couldn't breathe. The heat was unbearable, and his skin felt as though it were going to melt. The car jerked violently as Max slammed on the brakes, trying desperately to stop before they were swallowed whole by the fire. Go, go, go! Michael screamed, his voice breaking through the panic like a lifeline. Max didn't hesitate. He slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward, hurtling down the road, faster and faster. The flames were everywhere now, on both sides. Just moments ago, it had been a flickering glow on the horizon, but now it was all-consuming. The air burned with a thick scent of ash, the sound of crackling wood and burning trees deafening in their ears. "We can't outrun it," Walter whispered from the back seat, his voice ragged and broken. "It's too late. It's already here." And then, just as the fire seemed to surround them, to claim them whole, a voice shattered the tension. A shout from somewhere in the chaos. "Everyone, get out of the cars!" A police officer, desperate and wild-eyed, was running down the road, waving his arms frantically. His uniform was stained with ash, his face smeared with soot. The sirens blared behind him, warning everyone in their path to abandon their vehicles. "You need to get out. Now!" The officer's words were in order, sharp and final, but it was too late for anyone to listen. The car was moving, the heat surrounding them, the flames reaching in through the windows. Michael didn't have time to think. There was no choice but to keep moving forward, no time to wonder if this escape would be their last. "It's too close," Michael thought, barely able to form the words. "We're too close to the end." The car jolted forward with a screech as Max tried to force it through the thickening smoke. Every movement, every turn was a gamble. But no matter how fast he drove, it felt as though the fire was always a step ahead, pushing forward relentlessly. The heat was unbearable now, seeping through the windows, stinging Michael's face as if the very air were on fire. Sweat poured down his back, but there was no relief from the stifling heat. Suddenly, the car veered to a halt. The roar of the flames was too close now, too overwhelming, and they were trapped. Not a road in sight to escape the oncoming inferno. Max's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white with fear, and for a moment, no one spoke. "It's over," Walter whispered from the back seat, his voice trembling in the growing chaos. "We're trapped." But Michael knew they couldn't stay there. They had no choice but to leave the car. It was too dangerous. They were too close to the fire, and no one would make it if they stayed. "We have to go," Michael said, his voice urgent. His words were like a spark that lit the fuse in Max's eyes. Without another word, Max threw the car into park, the tires screeching as they came to a sudden stop. The heat hit them immediately. It was suffocating, like standing in the middle of an oven, and the air was thick with smoke, stinging their eyes. Michael opened the door slowly, every creak of the metal sounding louder than the roar of the fire outside. The world around them had already begun to change. The ground beneath them was warm, almost burning through their shoes. Michael's heart raced with every step as he turned to help Walter out of the car, the frail, elderly man's eyes wide with panic. "Dad, we have to move," Michael said, gripping Walter's arm, but Walter wasn't responding. His face was pale, a ghostly color, and his body trembled in fear. His legs, once strong, were now useless. They had no time. They couldn't wait. In desperation, Michael pulled out the walker from the back seat. It wasn't much, but it was something to help Walter move, even if it was just a little bit. Michael was breathing hard now, each breath strained with the weight of the decision. He had to make it out. They had to. With shaky hands, he folded the walker and placed it in front of Walter, guiding the frail man's hands onto it. The wood of the walker groaned under the pressure, as if protesting the weight of the situation. Walter's legs shook beneath him, barely able to stand. He clung to the walker as though it were his only lifeline. And maybe in that moment but there was no time to linger, no time to wonder if Walter would make it. The fire was on their heels, crackling louder now, closing in from every side. The roar of the flames was deafening, like an approaching freight train. Michael could feel the weight of the heat on his back as he pushed Walter forward, urging him to move. The ashes fell like snow, coating their clothes, their hair, their faces. Each step forward was a struggle. Each breath was a battle. "Keep moving," Michael told himself, but the words felt hollow. How long could they run? How far could they go? He glanced over his shoulder. The flames, huge, towering, were pushing through the dry brush. Their shadows stretched across the ground like monstrous arms reaching out to grab them. The very earth beneath their feet seemed to tremble with the fire's hunger. With every labored step, Michael could feel the air grow thinner, thicker with smoke and heat. His throat burned. His lungs felt like they were being set alight with every breath. Walter's walker was the only thing keeping the old man from collapsing, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Michael's mind raced, trying to find a way out, trying to remember the layout of the area, but it was all a blur now. His brain was consumed with a primal need to escape, to survive. And then in the distance, Michael saw it. A sliver of hope, a clearing. It was too far, but it was the only chance. He could see the outline of what appeared to be a small hill, a break in the landscape that might offer some refuge from the fire. But it was a stretch. Would they make it? Would they survive this hellish gauntlet of flames and heat? "We have to reach that hill," Michael said, his voice a strained whisper. He grabbed Walter's arm again, pulling him as gently as he could, trying to push them both forward with everything he had left. But Walter's steps were slow, agonizingly slow, and Michael's patience was fraying with every second that ticked by. "It's too much," Walter muttered under his breath, barely able to stand. "I can't keep up." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the fire, now raging behind them, the shriek of the wind as it fanned the flames. He didn't have time to think. He didn't have time to mourn. He only had time to run. And that's when it happened. Michael's foot slipped. The ground beneath him, still hot from the flames, gave way, and he stumbled forward, his heart leaping into his throat. He looked back in horror to see Walter, already stumbling, nearly falling behind him. The crack of dry branches sounded like a gunshot. The flames had reached the trees, their trunks now glowing red with fire. The wind howled, and Michael's mind screamed in terror. Was it too late for them? Were they doomed to burn? And then, just as they reached the hill, just as hope seemed possible, a shape emerged from the smoke. A figure, standing still in the fire's shadow. Someone waiting? Who was it? Michael thought. Was it another survivor? Or something else? They reached the hill. The small, jagged peak that offered what could only be described as an oasis of safety in a world consumed by fire. It was a patch of land untouched by the flames, a sliver of hope in the midst of destruction. As Michael dragged Walter up the final stretch, he could feel the change in the air. The heat, once suffocating, was now distant. The fire, which had followed them every step of the way, now seemed far behind, retreating as though it had been pushed back by some invisible force. Their lungs, aching with the smoke of the burning city, finally found a moment of clarity. The air felt different here, cleaner, cooler, though the world around them was still choked with the remnants of devastation. "We're out," Michael whispered, his voice breaking, his legs trembling with the weight of what they had just endured. He dropped to his knees beside Walter, his heart still pounding in his chest, but with a sense of overwhelming relief flooding through him. Walter, too, sank to the ground beside him, his body shaking as though it couldn't quite comprehend the danger they had narrowly escaped. They had made it. They were alive. That was all that mattered now. As Michael looked around, his eyes flickered to the horizon, where the thick, black smoke still rose in a twisting column above the city, a reminder of the inferno that had nearly consumed them. And then the tears came. They were quiet at first, but as the enormity of what they'd survived pressed down on him, they became uncontrollable. There was no way to stop them. His hands trembled as he wiped his eyes, ashamed of the weakness, but he didn't care. They were alive, and that was all that mattered. "You did it," Walter said, his voice cracked with emotion. He was weak, but he could still speak, still see his son-in-law. "You kept us alive?" Michael nodded, unable to speak. What could he say? He had been the one to make the decision, the one to push forward when every part of him wanted to give in to fear. But it wasn't just him. It had been a team effort, a fight for survival, and someone else had helped them along the way. Max! The car finally stopped, and as Michael turned, he saw Max stepping out, his face streaked with soot, his eyes tired but alive. There was no grand hero's welcome, no grandiose speech. It wasn't necessary. Max had done something no one else had been able to do. He had been there when they needed him the most. Without him, without that car, without that brief moment of hope, they might not have made it out at all. "You saved us," Michael said, voice thick with emotion. He felt something he hadn't known he could still feel. Gratitude, deep and profound, for a man who was essentially a stranger. But in this moment, Max wasn't just a neighbor. He was their savior. He was the thread that had kept them connected to life when everything else around them had been consumed by death. I couldn't leave you guys," Max said, his voice hoarse. "I know how hard it was. We've all been through hell today. But you made it. You're here. That's what matters." In that moment, Michael understood something. It wasn't just survival. It wasn't just about making it out of the fire. It was about the connections we make in the darkest times. The kindness of strangers, the acts of bravery that we don't ask for, but somehow receive just when we need them most. Max wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, but in Michael's eyes, in Walter's eyes, he was nothing short of a savior. As the two men shared a long, wordless glance, the weight of everything that had happened slowly began to sink in. The fire was still out there, still raging in the distance. But they were safe. For now. And in that fleeting moment of peace, Michael closed his eyes, allowing himself the luxury of believing that, against all odds, they had survived. They sat there, watching the fire in the distance, knowing that tomorrow would bring more uncertainty. But tonight, they had survived. They had outlasted the nightmare. And for Michael, that was enough. His family was safe. And no matter what tomorrow brought, he knew one thing. He would never take his loved ones, his home, his life for granted again. The fires had consumed the land, but it could not take away what they had fought for, what they had saved. And for that, Michael would be forever grateful. And so, as the night drew in and the fires began to fade from sight, Michael and Walter sat together, grateful for the hands that helped them through the darkest hours of their lives. The road to safety had been paved not just with grit and determination, but with the kindness of a stranger. And in the end, that was enough to rebuild what had nearly been destroyed. The days that followed felt like an endless blur, moments of clarity in between stretches of deep, gnawing exhaustion. Michael and his father-in-law, Walter, spent those first few hours of safety in silence. There was no need for words. The trauma of what they had endured spoke for itself. The news reports of the Palisades fire were everywhere, but to Michael, they seemed distant. The world outside could never capture the rawness of what he'd just lived through. No screen could truly show the fire as he had seen it, as it had chased him. But as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, Michael began to reflect on the event that had nearly cost him everything. In the quiet of his new home, far from the destruction they had left behind, Michael found himself staring out at the world in a way he hadn't before. Everything felt different now. He looked at Walter, his father-in-law, who sat in the chair by the window, slowly but steadily recovering from the physical toll the escape had taken on his frail body. The fire had changed them, both inside and out. The strength that had pulled them through had been tested, and though it was scarred, it had held firm. For the first time, Michael felt what it meant to have true resilience. It wasn't just about surviving a fire, a moment of terror. It was about what came after. What would they do now that they had survived? How would they rebuild, not just their homes, but themselves? In the wake of the fire, Michael had found himself questioning so many things. The fragile nature of life, the value of family, and the inherent goodness in people. The act of running from the flames with Walter had forged a bond between them, one that neither of them had anticipated, but both felt deeply. The desperation of that flight, the determination to survive, had wiped away any remaining hesitation between them. There were no more barriers. It was just them. And in the weeks after the fire, Michael became fiercely protective of his family, cherishing the time he had with them. It wasn't just about avoiding the next catastrophe. It was about living, really living. And that meant, above all, being present for those who needed him most. But beyond the personal reflection, Michael's mind often wandered back to the people who had helped him along the way. Max, the neighbor who had, without a second thought, pulled him and Walter out of the fire's path, who had risked everything just to offer a glimmer of hope when it seemed all but lost. It was Max who had reminded him of the power of community. No one could do it alone, not in moments of crisis, not when the world was burning around you. And as the fire slowly became a distant memory, one that would forever burn its mark in his mind, Michael realized that in times like those, the most precious resource was each other. The more people who reached out, the more who acted when the situation seemed hopeless, the stronger the community became. He could never have made it out without Max. And Max, Michael knew, would have never hesitated to help again if the flames ever returned. The fires of that January were gone, their ashes scattered across the land. But the fire they had ignited in Michael, one of gratitude, resilience, and the deep understanding of what it meant to care for others, would burn for much longer. His view of emergency preparedness had changed forever. He saw now that it wasn't just about having supplies ready or a bag packed with essentials. It wasn't even just about knowing where the escape routes were. It was about understanding the value of planning together, of sharing resources, of supporting your neighbors when they couldn't help themselves. In those desperate moments, it wasn't a list of instructions or strategies that saved them. It was the willingness of others to step in and offer help, no questions asked. The fire, in its wake, had taught him more than he had ever expected to learn. It had shown him that preparedness wasn't just an individual responsibility. It was collective. And as he sat there, on that quiet afternoon, staring out at the horizon, Michael made a vow to himself. He would never again take his family's safety for granted. They had gotten lucky. Lucky to survive, lucky to have Max, lucky that the winds hadn't shifted sooner. But luck would only get them so far. The next time there might not be a Max. The next time it might be up to them alone. The fire had shown him the terrifying unpredictability of life. And though he couldn't control the flames, he could control his response to them. He would teach his family to be resilient. He would prepare them, not just with supplies, but with knowledge. And in that knowledge, he would instill the most vital lesson of all. It was in the act of helping others that we found our true strength. It was through standing together, supporting each other through our darkest moments, that we would truly survive. The fires were behind them, but the lessons they left behind would endure. As Michael looked at Walter, then at the photo of his family sitting on the mantel, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The world had shown its worst, but it had also shown its best. And in that balance of destruction and kindness, of fear and survival, Michael had found a new way to see the world. A way that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, would guide him through even the darkest of times. In the end, it wasn't the fire that defined them. It was the way they came through it. Together, the world around you was burning. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your stories, your ideas on how we can better prepare for the unexpected. Could you be the next one to step in like Max when disaster strikes? If you found this story powerful and thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more survival stories that push the boundaries of courage and resilience. Every share could help someone else find the strength they didn't know they had. And if you want to support wildfire victims like Michael and his father-in-law, check out the links in the description. Together, we can help rebuild lives, restore hope, and make sure no one is left behind in the wake of these disasters. Michael and his father-in-law survived, but the truth is, thousands of others weren't as lucky. In those final hours, as the flames closed in, it was clear that not everyone would make it out alive. So, the question remains, could we be doing more to prevent these tragedies? Could we have stopped the flames before they even began to roar? As the sun sets over the charred remains of a once vibrant landscape, it's easy to forget how quickly everything can change. Could our preparations, our actions in moments like this, be enough to prevent another family from going through what Michael did? Or is it simply a matter of time before the next fire starts and the next story like Michael's is written? The answers are still out there, and perhaps we're not prepared enough to find them.